Some days don't begin with energy. They begin with weight. You open your eyes, and before anything even happens, you already feel it. You feel behind. You feel tired. You feel like something is pressing down on you and you can't fully explain why. It's not always one big problem. Sometimes it's everything at once. Responsibilities, expectations, pressure you put on yourself, and pressure others place on you. It builds quietly, layer by layer, until even the simplest things begin to feel heavier than they should. And still you keep going. You tell yourself to stay strong, to push through, to not fall behind. But there comes a point where pushing feels different, where it no longer feels like progress, but survival. And that is the moment most people never talk about. The moment where you're still showing up, still doing what needs to be done, still functioning on the outside, but inside, something feels drained, not broken, just worn down. Worn down from carrying too much for too long. And in that moment, the hardest part isn't the work itself. It's the feeling that you have to keep doing it. That slowing down is not an option. That stopping even for a moment might cause everything to fall apart. So you continue. You hold it together. You keep moving. But quietly, a question begins to rise inside you. How long can I keep doing this? How much more can I carry before something gives? And that question doesn't mean you're weak. It means something needs to shift. Not necessarily in your circumstances, but in how you respond to them. Because if nothing changes in how you carry this weight, it will only feel heavier. There is a moment, right in the middle of that pressure, where you have a choice. Not a loud one, not a dramatic one, but a quiet decision. How will I move forward from here? Most people don't make that decision consciously. They let the weight decide for them. They slow down. They lose focus. They pull back just enough to feel comfortable again. And over time, that small shift becomes a pattern that slowly moves them away from where they wanted to go. But there is another way to respond, not by pretending the weight isn't there, not by ignoring it, but by refusing to let it decide your next step, by choosing to move, even when it feels difficult. Because strength is not built when things are easy. It is built here, in moments like this, when everything feels heavier than it should, and you decide to keep going anyway. That's where something begins to change. Not outside, but inside you. There is a voice that appears when life gets heavy, a quiet one. It tells you to slow down, to wait, to stop pushing so hard, and if you listen to it long enough, it starts to sound reasonable, even comforting. But there is another voice, quieter, less frequent, but far more powerful. And when it speaks, it reminds you of something deeper, that you are still capable, that this moment is not the end, but a test of how you respond. There are burdens a man carries that are never spoken aloud. They do not always appear suddenly, nor do they come from a single source. They form gradually, through responsibility, through expectation, through the steady accumulation of demands placed upon him by life, and often by himself. If I were to begin again, I would not first look at what is happening around me, but at what I have allowed to gather within me. Because it is not always the size of a problem that creates weight, but the number of them carried without pause. Many experience this condition without fully understanding it. A man wakes up, prepares for the day, and before any task has begun, he already feels the strain of what lies ahead. Not from one difficulty, but from many combined, layered together, carried without release. This is not weakness, it is accumulation. If I were beginning again, I would recognize that clearly. There is also the nature of this weight. It does not announce itself loudly. A man continues to function. He fulfills his obligations. He completes what must be done. From the outside, he appears steady, composed, capable. Yet internally, there is pressure. If I were beginning again, I would not mistake outward control for inner ease. There is also the habit of silent endurance. A man often believes it is his responsibility to carry everything alone. He continues without pause, without complaint, without showing strain. And in doing so, he strengthens one part of himself, yet burdens another. If I were beginning again, I would understand that endurance, when unexamined, leads not only to strength, but to exhaustion. There is also a misunderstanding of strength itself. Many believe that strength means not feeling pressure, not experiencing strain, not being affected by difficulty. But that is not true. Strength is not the absence of weight. It is the ability to carry it without allowing it to control your direction. If I were beginning again, I would redefine strength in that way. There is a moment that comes quietly when a man begins to feel that what once seemed manageable now requires more effort than before. Simple tasks feel heavier. Decisions feel more demanding. Not because they have changed, but because what he carries has increased. This is the moment where awareness must begin. If I were beginning again, I would not ignore it. There is also the danger of misinterpretation. A man may begin to believe that he is becoming weaker, less capable, less focused. Yet often, this is not true. What has changed is not his ability, but his load. If I were beginning again, I would not question my strength too quickly. I would examine what I am carrying. Many continue in this condition for long periods. They meet expectations. They fulfill responsibilities. They remain consistent, yet they do so with increasing strain. And because they continue, others see them as strong, even when internally they feel heavy. If I were beginning again, I would understand that being seen as strong does not remove the need to manage what I carry. There is also the compounding effect of unaddressed pressure. Each responsibility added, each expectation accepted, each demand fulfilled without pause contributes to the total weight. Individually, each may seem manageable. Together, they become something much greater. If I were beginning again, I would become aware of this accumulation early. There is also a clear difference between those who recognize this weight and those who do not. One becomes aware. He observes what he carries. He adjusts how he responds. The other continues without awareness, believing that persistence alone is enough. Over time, their paths begin to separate. If I were beginning again, I would choose awareness. There have been men who carried immense responsibility and yet maintained direction. They did not avoid pressure, they did not escape weight, but they learned how to manage it. Their strength was not in avoiding burden, but in not allowing it to alter their movement. If I were beginning again, I would study that difference carefully. There is also the perception of others. A man who continues under pressure appears composed, reliable, strong, yet few understand what he carries internally. Few see the effort required to maintain that position. This creates a separation between appearance and reality. If I were beginning again, I would not rely on appearance as proof of stability. There is also a gradual shift that occurs if this weight is not managed. A man begins to slow, not physically at first, but mentally. His clarity weakens. His focus becomes divided, not because he lacks discipline, but because his attention is consumed by what he carries. If I were beginning again, I would protect my clarity, because clarity determines direction, and direction determines outcome. There is also an important realization. A man cannot always remove what he carries, but he can change how he carries it. He can adjust his response. He can strengthen his position. He can reduce the influence of weight without removing its presence. If I were beginning again, I would focus on this ability. There is also the beginning of control. Not control over circumstances, but control over response. A man recognizes that while he cannot eliminate every responsibility, he can decide how those responsibilities affect him. He can choose whether weight slows him or strengthens him. If I were beginning again, I would take this control deliberately. There is also a shift from resistance to acceptance. A man stops asking why the weight exists. He stops fighting its presence. Instead, he acknowledges it. And in doing so, he reduces its power, because what is resisted often grows stronger. If I were beginning again, I would remove unnecessary resistance. There is also a transformation that occurs when awareness is applied. A man no longer feels overwhelmed in the same way, not because the weight has disappeared, but because he understands it. He sees it clearly, and in that clarity, he is no longer controlled by it. If I were beginning again, I would seek clarity before relief. There is also a quiet strengthening that follows. A man becomes more grounded, more stable, more deliberate. His actions are no longer dictated by pressure, but by direction. And in that shift, he regains control. If I were beginning again, I would build this steadiness. There is also a final realization. The weight a man carries is not always a signal to stop. It is often a sign that he has taken on more and must now become stronger in how he carries it. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say this: recognize what you carry, but do not allow it to define your movement. Fix this deeply in your mind. I carry weight, but I remain steady. I move forward regardless. Because the moment you understand this, everything begins to change. Having recognized the weight you carry, the next principle is to understand what happens inside you when that weight begins to press against your movement. Because it is not the weight alone that determines your direction, it is your response to it. And that response does not begin with action, it begins with thought. There is a moment that comes to every person under pressure. It is not loud, it is not dramatic, but it is decisive. You feel the weight, and something inside you begins to speak, not in commands, but in suggestions. A quiet voice that tells you to slow down, to wait, to ease off, to stop pushing so hard. And because the pressure is real, that voice sounds reasonable. It feels justified. If I were beginning again, I would not accept what feels reasonable without examining it, because not everything that feels right in a moment of pressure leads you in the right direction. There is also another voice, one that is quieter, less immediate, but far more powerful. It does not offer comfort. It does not seek relief. It reminds you of something deeper, that you are still capable of continuing, even if it is difficult. It does not promise ease. It demands movement. The problem is not that this second voice is absent. The problem is that most people never give it enough space to be heard. They follow the first voice automatically. They slow down slightly. They delay slightly. They withdraw just enough to feel relief. And because the change is small, it goes unnoticed. But over time, that small shift becomes a pattern. And that pattern begins to shape direction. If I were beginning again, I would become aware of these small shifts, because they matter more than they appear. There is also the illusion of rest that must be understood. Rest is necessary when it is intentional. It restores energy. It prepares you to continue. But withdrawal is different. Withdrawal reduces direction. It weakens consistency. And often, it disguises itself as rest. A man tells himself he will return stronger, that this is only temporary, that he just needs a moment. And sometimes that is true, but when repeated often, it becomes delay. If I were beginning again, I would learn to distinguish clearly between rest and retreat, because one strengthens you and the other slowly pulls you away from where you intended to go. There is also the way patterns are formed. A man does not stop all at once. He reduces slightly, then slightly more. His intensity lowers, his focus softens, his direction becomes less clear. And because the change is gradual, he adapts to it. He begins to accept it as normal. Over time, that reduced version of himself becomes familiar. It becomes comfortable, and eventually, it becomes identity. If I were beginning again, I would interrupt that pattern early, before it becomes fixed. Because once it becomes identity, it begins to guide your decisions without effort. There is also the strengthening of whatever voice you follow. Each time you listen to the voice that tells you to slow down unnecessarily, it becomes louder, more convincing, more natural. And eventually, it no longer feels like a suggestion. It feels like truth. But the opposite is also true. Each time you continue despite pressure, the second voice grows stronger. It becomes clearer, more stable, more present. And over time, it begins to guide your response without hesitation. If I were beginning again, I would build that second voice through action, not intention. Because action is what reinforces belief. There is also the realization that this conflict never fully disappears. It is not something you eliminate. It is something you decide through. The voice that suggests withdrawal will always appear, but it only gains power when it is followed. If you choose not to follow it, it weakens. If I were beginning again, I would focus on decision, not elimination. Because control is not the absence of pressure. It is the ability to act despite it. There is also the emergence of a quiet strength when you continue. It is not dramatic. It is not visible, but it is real. You feel the weight, you hear the voice, and you move anyway. That is not force. That is control. And control, once developed, changes everything. There is also the compounding effect of small actions. A single step may seem insignificant, but repeated, it builds direction. And direction, when maintained, leads to results. Many underestimate this because they are looking for large changes. But large outcomes are built from small, consistent movement. If I were beginning again, I would not underestimate small progress. Because small progress, when continued, becomes powerful. There is also the difference between two paths over time. One person withdraws slightly, then more, until their direction fades. The other continues slightly, then more, until their direction strengthens. The difference is not in ability. It is in response. If I were beginning again, I would focus on how I respond in small moments, because those moments define everything that follows. There is also a transformation that occurs when continuation becomes habit. A person no longer debates internally in the same way. They feel pressure, but they do not question whether to move. They simply move. Not because it is easy, but because it has become their standard. If I were beginning again, I would continue until this becomes natural. Because when continuation becomes automatic, hesitation disappears. And when hesitation disappears, progress accelerates. There is also the understanding that your direction is not determined by what you carry, but by the decisions you make while carrying it. And those decisions are made in moments so small they are often overlooked. If I were to express this as a principle, it would be this. When the voice of withdrawal appears, recognize it, but do not follow it. Fix this deeply in your mind. I continue. I do not retreat. I move forward regardless of how I feel. Because once this becomes your pattern, everything begins to shift. You are no longer controlled by pressure. You are no longer guided by comfort. You are guided by decision. And that is where real strength is built. There is also another layer to understand. Strength is often misunderstood. Many believe strength is energy, intensity, or the absence of struggle. But true strength is none of these. It is the ability to continue when none of those things are present. It is the ability to act when you do not feel ready, when you do not feel supported, when nothing around you has changed. If I were beginning again, I would not measure strength by how I feel, but by how I move when feeling offers no support. Because waiting for the right feeling often delays action indefinitely. There is also the habit of waiting for relief. A person believes that once they feel lighter, clearer, more prepared, they will act better. But relief does not always come when expected. And if action depends on relief, progress becomes inconsistent. If I were beginning again, I would not wait for the weight to lessen. I would move while it remains, because movement is what builds strength, not waiting. There is also the realization that discomfort is not a signal to stop. It is a condition of growth. It does not mean something is wrong. It means something is being built. If I were beginning again, I would accept discomfort as part of the process. There is also the difference between acting with energy and acting with discipline. Energy rises and falls. It depends on mood, environment, and condition. But discipline remains. It allows action to continue regardless of feeling. If I were beginning again, I would build discipline beyond emotion. Because discipline creates consistency, and consistency creates results. There is also a shift that must occur. Instead of asking, "Do I feel capable?" the question becomes, "Will I act regardless?" That question removes dependence on condition and places responsibility on decision. If I were beginning again, I would ask that question often. There is also the strengthening of identity through repetition. Each time you act without waiting for the right feeling, you reinforce a new belief about yourself, that you are not controlled by how you feel, that you can move forward under any condition. And over time, that belief becomes stable. It becomes who you are. If I were beginning again, I would build that identity deliberately. There is also the transformation that follows. What once felt difficult becomes manageable. What once required effort becomes natural. Not because the situation changed, but because you did. There is also the final realization. Strength is not proven when things are easy. It is revealed when things are difficult. And you move anyway. If I were to express this as instruction, it would be simple. Do not wait for the weight to leave. Move with it. Fix this firmly in your mind. I act without waiting. I continue without relief. I move as I am. Because when you begin to live this way, your progress is no longer dependent on conditions. It becomes consistent. And consistency, over time, becomes unstoppable. In the end, the weight does not define you. What defines you is how you move while carrying it. Life will not always feel light. There will be periods where everything feels heavier than it should. Responsibilities will increase, pressure will build, expectations will not disappear. And there will be moments where continuing feels more difficult than stopping. But those moments are not the end. They are the point where everything is decided. Because most people do not stop all at once. They stop gradually. They slow down slightly. They delay slightly. They withdraw just enough to feel temporary relief. And over time, that small retreat becomes a new direction, a direction that leads away from what they once intended to build. But there are others who respond differently. They feel the same weight. They face the same pressure. They hear the same internal voice telling them to slow down, to wait, to step back. But they do not follow it. They continue. Not because it is easy, but because they understand something most people do not. That strength is not found in avoiding weight. It is built by carrying it correctly. There is a moment in the middle of difficulty where a decision must be made. Not a large decision. Not one that changes everything instantly, but a small one, a quiet one. Do you continue or do you retreat? That decision may seem insignificant, but repeated over time, it becomes your direction. And your direction becomes your result, because your life is not shaped by a single action. It is shaped by patterns, patterns of thought, patterns of response, patterns of decision. If your pattern is to wait for things to feel better, to feel lighter, to feel easier, then your progress will always depend on conditions. And conditions are never stable. But if your pattern becomes this, to act regardless, to move regardless, to continue regardless, then your progress becomes independent. Independent of mood, independent of pressure, independent of circumstance. And that is where real control begins. Not control over life itself, but control over how you meet it. There is also a shift that happens when you begin to live this way. You stop asking whether things are too heavy. You stop asking whether you feel ready. You stop asking whether now is the right time. Because those questions no longer determine your action. Instead, you begin to operate from something more stable, decision. You decide to move. And once that decision is made, the rest becomes simple. Not easy, but clear. You act, you continue, you build, even when it feels difficult. And over time, that consistency changes you. You become stronger, more focused, more grounded, not because the weight disappeared, but because you learned how to carry it. There is also a quiet confidence that forms. Not loud, not visible, but steady. You begin to trust yourself, not because you always feel ready, but because you know you will act anyway. And that trust becomes your foundation. It allows you to move forward without hesitation, to continue without needing reassurance, to face pressure without losing direction. This is what separates those who break under weight from those who are built by it. It is not the absence of difficulty. It is the response to it. So the next time life feels heavy, do not ask how to escape it. Do not wait for it to disappear. Ask something else. Will I continue anyway? Because that answer determines everything. It determines whether this moment becomes a stopping point or a strengthening point. Fix this deeply in your mind. I do not wait for life to feel light. I move forward as it is. Because when you live this way, nothing can truly stop you. Not pressure, not doubt, not difficulty. Because your progress no longer depends on how things feel. It depends on what you decide. And once that becomes your pattern, your direction becomes unbreakable.